No, I can't repeat that joke. You have to, I'm Phillip Henderson from the Surdna Foundation. So I was just asked to come in and say a couple of words about why the Surdna Foundation is interested in communications issues and why, in particular, around green economy issues, the issues that are being dealt with over these several days by all of you. I think there's a couple of things that interest us. One is that we're a foundation that believes in sustainability, and we are investing nationally in a whole range of sustainability issues, one of which is directly on environmental concerns. And I think one of the things that we notice is that we really believe that the facts are on our side most of the time, but that's not always the way it plays out in the political world, it's not always the way it plays out in the media, it's not always the way it plays out in the sensibilities of everyday citizens. And I think we've seen what seemed like a clear win, which was the green economy, talking about the future of where the world was going, where the United States was going, turn into what feels like a loser issue. And we've seen it happen in a fairly short period of time as these things go, and it really has been of concern to us because it's meant that all of the investments that you all are making on the ground, all the investments that we're making at the regional and national level as a funder, can be undermined very quickly when the terminology we're using, when the way we're framing the issue, and the way the issue plays against other issues that are of concern to people. For example, the concern about the economy, the concern about jobs, are running counter to the things that we care about. And so we actually have been engaged with Spitfire strategies for a long time on things that were more navel-gazing for us, like what should the Surdna Foundation do in the world, and had begun working with them on some more outward-looking things. And so I actually asked Spitfire to come in and work with our grantees and survey the territory to help us get smarter about this. And we're excited that you're going to hear some of that data today, and we hope that you'll find it interesting and useful food for thought that you can take back and embed in your thinking going forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Danielle. If you, I gather, are going to introduce yourself. And she'll take it away, and I will be here to save her if she begins to have trouble with microphones and other things. But I want to thank you all for taking a listen to this. And we would love, Michelle and I, but I'm sure the folks at Spitfire would love your feedback both today and as you go forward, just helping us to continue to think and refine this so that it actually is useful to us, and that we can make smart investments in how we talk about these issues that we think are really long-term winners. So, Danielle.
Thanks, Mel. And I just wanted to ensure that this is live feed, right?
Oh, right, yes. This is a live feed. Everyone's on camera. I think you may have heard that before, but that was one of the things I was supposed to say. Sorry about that, Denise.
Great. Thank you guys so much. I'm Danielle Lewis. I'm a vice president with Spitfire Strategies. I've had the pleasure of working there for almost 8 years. We are headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and if you're not familiar with us, we're a communications firm that works exclusively with nonprofits and foundations. And what brings all of our clients together is the desire to create positive social change or make the world a better place, but we work on issues that range from the green economy to sustainable seafood to global health and development. This has been a really terrific project to partner with the Surdna Foundation and its grantees on. I think Surdna did a really important thing in recognizing that this was becoming an increasingly challenging issue to communicate on, which was a real change from when the issue hit the scene a couple of years ago, and to sort of recognize that, to take the time to spend the money to invest in figuring out why that was. And that's where we came in. So what I'm going to do today is chat with you briefly about our sort of methodology, what we did as part of our research, and then walk you through our findings where we were able to see some clear communications challenges facing those of you who are working on green economy issues, as well as some really important opportunities. Then we'll pause for a little bit of Q&A and then move into sharing some of the recommendations that we provided to the foundation and its grantees about how they might strengthen the conversation. And we'll have just a few minutes at the end for some of your reactions and feedback to that. So we kicked off this effort in June with a planning meeting at the Surdna Foundation that brought together members of the nonprofit sector working on this issue, both sort of locally, regionally, and nationally. We also had government in the room, we had other funders in the room. Denise was there with us to really take a look at what were the big challenges, what were the big sticking points, what was making it difficult for the field, who were the major players on this, what did we want to know from this research. And we used what was coming out of that meeting to help us refine the scope of our research. I think we went into this with a plan and then we adjusted and changed up that plan a bit. Coming out of that meeting, we began looking really critically at the media coverage that was happening around this issue. We looked retroactively about a year to understand the messaging in play. We also conducted real-time media analysis as we went through the project, and both an exciting issue from seeing how an issue played in real time and a disheartening issue, the Solyndra situation, played out as we were working on the project and really gave us a lot of fodder for this media analysis, as you might imagine. We also conducted an in-depth look at the opposition on this issue, primarily at the national level, to really understand who were those organizations, what sectors were they coming from, what kinds of messages were they using, how organized were they, how disorganized were they, what kinds of data were they using to support their points. We heard at the planning meeting that understanding the right words to use was a big challenge on this issue. And before we recommended a whole bunch more opinion research, which as you all know is pretty expensive, we really wanted to look at the body of research that was already out there. So many organizations have done message research on this issue. So we cast a wide net to bring in as much of that as we could. As you all know, not everybody in the field likes to share their research. So some of that we were able to share back with you guys. Some of it was shared with us only confidentially, and we were able to understand it but not report it back in detail. And finally, we knew that while the situation at the national level was getting pretty dicey, we also knew that there had been some tremendous successes around the green economy at the regional and local levels. And we wanted to understand what were the factors that had led to those successes. What were the keys that made those things move? And so we took a look at 4 regions, New York, Houston, Ohio, and Kansas City, to really understand the successes there. And in particular, we did not look at the very progressive sort of coasts of the country, perhaps with the exception of New York, but we were focused much more on Buffalo, to really get a sense of how does this move in areas where moving it is not easy, and what can we learn from that? And so from all of that research, we pulled together a series of findings, and as I mentioned, really organized these around communications challenges and opportunities. So some of these are probably not going to be surprising to you. But one thing that was very clear to us was that at the national level, this is a really negative conversation right now, and it's a really political one. Right? So Solyndra did not do y'all any favors, and the narrative really is turning on that, at least at the national level. Green jobs not getting as much traction, much more space for the opposition, and really, really politicized, really associated with the Obama administration. And those that want to differentiate themselves from the president right now are using this as a leg to stand on. I would say it's just as much of a political hot button as we've seen issues around marriage equality or stem cell research be in the past. Don't think that's likely to change at the national level as we go through the next year's election cycle. If anything, it might get worse, right? We also learned from our research that the phrase green jobs is a tricky thing. We looked at a lot of research findings that looked at just those terms, and we looked particularly at research findings that said, what do people think about green jobs claims? You know, this one is going to create X many thousands of green jobs. And what we found is that people don't find them believable, those claims. I think that this maybe is because green jobs is a little bit of an opaque phrase. They're not exactly sure what is in there. But the phrase itself doesn't test well. In addition, the green in green jobs is challenging right now, as maybe some of you guys know, and one of the things we certainly heard locally was that green wasn't the strongest reason why those successes happened. When you look at those polls that show the list of Americans' priorities right now, jobs and the economy are at the top, and the environment is quite a ways down the list. And that's not to say that folks don't care about the environment. It is to say that it's not the most salient, most motivating reason for doing something right now, unfortunately. And I say that with some sadness, as a big part of my work at Spitfire is with different environmental groups, but it is the reality right now. And then lastly, there's a piece in this green jobs thing that has become so strongly associated with the federal government and its role in creating jobs. And people right now don't really think the federal government can do much right. And they're really skeptical of job creation claims coming out of the federal government, and they're really skeptical in general that they can get anything done. And so you put all of that together, and that green jobs phrase is carrying a lot of baggage for y'all right now. As we looked across the opposite...
Healthcare is too, right? So we're part of...
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of issues that carry a lot of... There's a lot of issues that carry a lot of baggage right now. I wish there was a better news on the green jobs front. As we looked at the opposition, we hoped to find that they would be very disorganized, you know, not be creating a steady drumbeat. But the truth is, they're tremendously organized. And they are really focused on a core set of messages. There are about 4 that really play out hard in the coverage. One of them is really around the government role and what the government should or shouldn't be doing. And it says that when the government invests in green jobs or green economy, it distorts the market. It should be something that private sector is doing. There's a huge opposition message that y'all have probably heard, that green jobs aren't real, right? This is a fiction, it's a green unicorn. They're not actually happening. There's another piece on the costs being greater than the benefit. That's all those stories where you see that the jobs cost each $1.7 million, right? Terrible stories. And then there's a piece that the green jobs are actually getting created overseas, right? We're spending money here to create jobs in China or Europe or other places. So interestingly, those 4 core message themes are reinforced, and here you just see some of the top national opponents. They are reinforced really consistently by all of these organizations. So from the ones that are just sort of energy organizations to the ones that are conservative think tanks, to all of the other opposition folks that we don't show here that are the different pundits and politicians. They're all reinforcing the same set of messages. They may not all reinforce all 4, but in general, they're not really straying too far from this choir book. And what happens is that creates this really strong echo effect of all of these messages over and over and over again. And they don't just do it with their messages, they also do it with their data and message supports. So if I see one more article that has that Spain report in it about how 2.2 jobs get lost every time one green economy job is created, it is their favorite data point and they like to reinforce it over and over again. So, you know, this is not, the opposition I wouldn't say is more organized on this than they are on other things. I think the opposition on the right is always incredibly organized. It's one of their greatest strengths, right? However, it makes it all the more challenging that on our side, with the tremendous, phenomenal groups that are all advocating for this issue, we are very creative. We have a lot of messages. We have 1,000,001 reasons why the green economy is a phenomenal thing. But it doesn't create an echo or a drumbeat, right? It's sort of like 1,000 flowers are blooming, but we don't have a bouquet. So I think we really saw that play out in the response to Solyndra, where there wasn't just one consistent way of dealing with that opposition. Some folks were talking about carbon, some folks were talking about growth of the middle class, some folks were talking about competitiveness, and it was just really all over the place. And so this sort of dynamic where the opposition is incredibly organized, creating a drumbeat, you guys have a lot of different messages, a lot of good ones, but just sort of so many that there's no strong echo, leaves us space for the opposition to be defining what this issue is, rather than for you guys to be defining what the green economy is and what its benefits are. And I think that's probably the largest challenge in terms of turning this conversation around. That is a very big load of sad challenges. So let's talk about the opportunities. One thing that was really exciting for us was that while the national conversation is tough, locally things look brighter. And even as we were seeing increasingly negative national coverage, we still saw positive local stories, right? We talked to these localities where great things are happening. So we know it's possible to move this locally. However, in that kind of research, we definitely heard that it was more about the jobs in the green, right? It's more about what are the direct benefits to the local community. And when we talked to each of those 4 regions that had been successful in moving things, they said, yeah, I mean, nobody was against the green, but it was really about how are we going to revitalize this neighborhood, what kinds of businesses was this going to bring to our region, those kinds of things. The other thing that was really promising locally, and this may be a little different now, but at least at the time when these successes were happening, the green jobs aren't real message didn't get much traction in these communities. And they thought the reason for this was because people could really see it. It was real in their communities. They could see the buildings, they could see the companies coming, they could see the people going back to work. And that kind of direct proof did a lot to counter or inoculate against that kind of opposition. So that's pretty exciting, particularly since all of you guys are working in those localities to move this forward. Another opportunity that was very interesting to us is that while green jobs doesn't test well, clean energy jobs test better. And some of the polling says that that could be because, in general, oil companies don't test well at all, right? Most of us don't like oil companies. We don't really understand why they keep profiting while our gas prices keep going up. It seems like a pretty unfortunate thing. And so they don't like the fossil fuel companies. They do support clean energy, and Lake Research has done some polling since Solyndra that has shown that Solyndra hasn't changed that. There still is some pretty strong support for clean energy. And clean energy jobs, as I mentioned, test better than green jobs. The research doesn't tell us why that is, and so I think that's something that could use some more research to explore. My speculation is that it may be more concrete. When you say clean energy, I can picture the solar panels or the wind energy, and I can understand what that is, but I'm not sure. I do think one of the challenges with this is a lot of folks define green jobs really broadly, and clean energy is a subset of that, right? But it's not the whole pie. And so something to really think about here is how hard you want to lean into this, the benefits versus the limitations of it. There are other message themes as well that are pretty promising, and that we think are worth trying and testing and seeing where they lead you. One is around American ingenuity, the idea of sort of homegrown solutions to American problems, really relying on what's been tested and proven in communities and replicating that. Pretty strong. And one that I imagine, since you guys are doing the work on the ground, probably makes a lot of sense to you. Related to that, while people don't like the government to regulate, and they don't think the government can create jobs successfully, they do support a role for the government in fostering innovation, keeping America innovative. And I think that's something that's really interesting. And then lastly, I would say probably the most predominant theme among the 1,000 that we saw move after Solyndra was around competitiveness. And we saw the administration start to reinforce that theme, and we also saw folks on the ground start to reinforce it. And there's some promise there, although I did also hear from some pollsters that sometimes among some audiences that has some baggage. And what they said specifically was, if you're talking to labor audiences, union members, they sometimes have found that companies use competitiveness as an excuse for lowering wages, changing practices, that sort of thing. And so again, something to be thought about and tested and played with there before deciding that competitiveness is the way to go. Lastly, on the opportunity side, there are some really tremendous local success stories, and we think that they are your best counter against the green jobs aren't real opposition. Because it's really hard to say they're not real when you have a family or a business or a community where it is real, where you can paint that picture. And that's a lot more believable than really big, grandiose claims about thousands and bazillions of jobs and how it's going to save the economy. I know that some of those local stories are out there because we're seeing them in the coverage, and so finding ways to elevate those is great. Finding more of them is even better. And along with that, and we saw this a little bit in your last panel, bringing really diverse messengers to the table so that the messages aren't just coming from the usual suspects. They're not just coming from the green groups. They're not just coming from the groups that have green economy in their name. They're coming from others that have a stake in the benefits that come from the green economy. And all the better if people see those messengers as more conservative or more moderate or not too lefty. I think the minute you're in that very lefty space, you play into the politicization of this. But the minute you're able to make this a more neutral, sort of depoliticized issue, you're having a better conversation. And this is a place where we actually saw a lot of strength in what was already happening in the field and locally, and we heard it as one of the key success factors in those 4 communities we looked at. Where it's not happening very much is at the national level. And when we looked at the Solyndra response, almost all the messages on our side were coming from the green groups and the green economy groups. Very little business, very little faith, very little labor, very little anything other than that. And that's a challenge. So I think we need to think about how we get more of those voices to be elevated. So I want to pause here for a second and ask for questions on the findings, and then get a little bit of sense of your reaction to this. I'm going to take you, and then we'll come to you in the back.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. That was excellent. Don Mathis, Community Action Partnership, and I'm on the Emerald City Board. I'm wondering if the recent resurgence of the inequality movement offers some opportunities for messaging. I work predominantly with anti-poverty stuff, and the notion of the 99% versus the 1% without the occupied baggage that goes with that, I think is resonating pretty well. I think there's some ways, and we work with Lake and other people too. I think there's some ways of packaging that in the sense of green that can say, well, you know, the 1% of the 1%, they have clean water, they have clean air, they don't have mercury in their food and other things, and the rest of us, I mean, people in Texas have become pretty sensitized to climate because their cornfields are all brown. And I think there's some ways of using the equality argument, and clearly the Obama people have latched onto that since Kansas, that we could use for our movement that could be one of your opportunities.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't thought this all through. I'd be interested in your reaction.
Sure.
But I think there's some possibility there.
Yeah. So we're going to talk in a minute about some of my recommendations. One of them is for some more message testing around a platform for the field. And I think that is definitely a fruitful area to look at, particularly to understand for what audiences is that really going to move, for what others do you need a different kind of argument. But I think that's right. I think that's created a lot of opening for a lot of issues. Which is
I mean, there's a lot of poverty. I mean, between the census numbers that have come out and the food stamp numbers, I mean, every day on an op-ed page somewhere they're talking about poor people, you know, college dropouts, Pell going down. I mean, there's a lot of momentum around the inequality thing that I think will spill over nicely to our stuff.
Right.
So
I think it could create a good opening for you. You're right. Great.
Thanks.
Can you take the mic to the back, and then we'll come back to you, sir.
So just a quick point. I actually think it's helpful, the point you made, and I don't think we put ourselves out as a green jobs group, but the point you made about elevating the word energy, because we are working in that space, and it also helps us to basically not be constrained by the fact that the so-called green part of the energy utility space is emerging. There are lots of jobs in the energy industry and the energy efficiency industry that we're trying to grow. So I like that you put that on the table, and I think it won't hurt us at all if we just keep that in mind. And our color is green, but we're not saying we're a green jobs group. We have to keep on drilling down on the fact that we're growing a new industry around energy efficiency, and it is going to make, you know, society more competitive, etc. And I think that helps us.
Great. We come up here to the man in the Virginia t-shirt.
Is that showing?
I went to the University of Richmond. We have to have
a... similar comment in that...
Introduce yourself.
Oh, okay. Gary Harris, Emerald Cities, Atlanta. Similar messaging and branding there, related to his comment. Looking at things from a clean energy perspective, vice green and such. Clean energy is a little bit more friendly. You know, there's a clean energy standard notion out there and such. And also, it makes it a bit more utility friendly as well, in that there's clean coal options and nuclear options as well, and all of those create jobs. So I'm just looking at that as a possible branding method, saying that clean energy experts, vice green experts, are initially.
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas we'd like to do some more testing in as well. And also to talk about it more with the field to see, is it a broad enough platform for folks to get on, or is it not, in which case it's not going to serve our purposes, so maybe it becomes a sub-point but not the whole umbrella. Right. I think there was a question right behind, and then we'll come over to this side.
Two things. One, I'm sorry, Joel Rogers, I'm with cows. We provide milk for the movement.
You want to test that mess?
We're going to check. We don't fart that much. Sorry, my bad.
Oh, no.
Man, I can tell it's the end of several days, you know?
This is his first day here.
Following on what Gary said, and before then Ruben, when you talked about clean energy, were you using that in the Obama administration sense of including efficiency as well as clean generation?
Honestly, the polling isn't that specific, and I think that's why you'd want to look at that more clearly. I do think that when people think of clean energy, they're thinking of the wind and they're thinking of the solar. They're not necessarily always thinking of the energy efficiency, but I don't see a reason why you couldn't pull that in there. So I think there's opportunities, but I think with more understanding of what people do think of when they think of that.
And the second question was, at COWS, we never talk about green jobs. We talk about greener jobs or greening the economy very deliberately, because we don't think that most people's activity, even if they're working on something which has those effects, is going to be entirely dedicated to climate mitigation or adaptation or any other definition of green job that we could possibly defend. Did you check that at all?
The polling, again, isn't that specific.
You know, the
greening versus green.
Yeah.
What we know right now is things that invoke the environment, for most audiences, it's not the strongest reason or framing to get them to move.
Okay.
So I think you might have some of those same challenges with greener or greening. But again, I think it's an area where we want to test and really understand the meaning behind the words. The polling right now tends to be broad. It's done with all voters. It doesn't often break down who the different groups are. And there were sort of, my biggest question was, they're like, and the green jobs doesn't work, and this was the result. And I was like, well, why? Like, where was the focus group finding where they asked why it didn't work? I think that's what is missing a little bit.
Let me just report our experience with green versus greener.
Mm-hmm.
When we say green jobs, which we don't actually say in public, but we say we got a challenge, produce, where's the job? We say greener, people say, well, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
You mean more sustainable? Oh, okay, yeah, I could see that. So it's worth maybe checking out.
Sure, it'd be worth looking at. All right, we had 2 over here, and then we're going to go into recommendations.
Guillermo Rodriguez, San Francisco. I'm in local government, and just as a reaction to the data, I think one of the other challenges that happened with the green jobs movement was local municipalities were kind of forced to create programs, create things that didn't exist. And so there wasn't any kind of standardization across the board. There was no way to measure. We were all at a loss, but yet there couldn't be a city anywhere in this country, especially large urban cities, that didn't have a green jobs program. And so we had to create these things and created expectations that didn't get delivered on, and it was just, monumentally difficult. And then the federal dollars coming to the states and then eventually to us in the municipalities really didn't give us the flexibility to be creative at the local level. So that was, I think, adding to some of the challenge, is that it was a bandwagon. Our cities had to jump on it. Our mayors jumped on it. We were all over the place. One of the things that we're looking at, I was on a call this morning with the urban sustainability directors. So we had about 20-some cities all having this same kind of conversation about what we're thinking in terms of the environment, and some of the issues that we're trying to push forward in terms of trying to keep our environmental policies, from energy efficiency, our climate action, all those things that aren't resonating anymore at the top of people's agendas. And what is jobs. So it really is now talking about marrying the concepts of economic development and job creation with our climate action plans, with our sustainability plans at a local level, and marrying those two so that we really have a sustainable economic development plan where we capture our environmental issues within their construct. Right. So that's just one thought for thinking about the future as you look at what other options are. That economic development strategy, which everyone understands and gets, and linking kind of the environmental aspects underneath that.
Great. Denise, did you have a question or a comment? You had your hand up before. You're good? All right, we'll take one more up here.
Thanks. I'm Don Gilligan from the National Association of Energy Service Companies. 2 points. One quick point. The Obama Clean Energy Standard does not include energy efficiency. They won't have energy efficiency in the standard because it knocks out everything else on the renewable side. And if there were some possibility of that being a national policy, that's a big issue you have to deal with. Second, I would urge people to refocus away from a national debate about green jobs. Once you get it to the local level, there's really not much of an argument in terms of the energy efficiency work that's being done. It has to have jobs. These buildings don't get retrofitted by magic. You can't even argue about it. And I think the second point is there's much more funding at the state level now than there's going to be at the federal level for the foreseeable future. The utilities next year we'll spend somewhere between $5 and $6 billion on energy efficiency programs. Those are programs which are designed and administered locally. You know, not even at the state level, in the, you know, wherever the utility headquarters is. That's where the action is. The ESCO industry adds on top of that another $5 billion worth of projects, which are all local, privately funded projects. That dwarfs whatever amount of money is going to be coming out of Washington, which is probably going to be negligible for the foreseeable future for energy efficiency. I mean, the Republicans in Congress are talking about zeroing out, if they're not talking about abolishing the energy department, they're talking about zeroing out key programs. So I would, for a lot of reasons, I would let the Heritage Foundation have the national debate, and they can, you know.
Don't, please don't.
No, but I mean, we should not be.
I understand what you're saying.
It's a waste of resources. They got a lot more money. They, you know, they're much more organized. Let's start. You know, let's work at the ground level where they don't really have an argument.
Yeah, I think and that's going to lead really nicely into talking through some of our recommendations. You know, I think a huge takeaway from us for this, whenever there's a conversation that's going south in a very public way, like it's on the front page of the New York Times, or during the summer, every morning I would go pick up the paper outside my door. I still get the real Washington Post. And there would be another front page Slyndra story, and I was like, oh, right? There's this urge to fight back, to do a lot of media, to get our messages out there, to counter at the national level. And my sense is that what you would have to show for that at the end of it is a large book of media clips, but you wouldn't actually have any real policy changes right now. I just don't think you have the landscape or the climate in place to move that nationally at the moment. I don't think you're going to have that in the next year. We're going to cross our fingers that we get to have that after that. And so I do think the movement is in the state and local level. I think it's where you can have more successes, and then you have these proof points that you can hold up and say, hey, this works, and try to move it again nationally. But I do think that sort of more bottom-up approach right now is probably going to be a more effective one. As we then think about that, we wanted to think about both recommendations that folks could start implementing and playing with now in their day-to-day work. I know you guys are communicating about this every single day. We also, though, wanted to think about some recommendations that couldn't be implemented right away, that would need some additional research, funding, thinking, and have a balance of both. So I'll walk you through the right now, and then I'll walk you through the near future, and then we'll pause for a kind of final round of questions and discussions before we close. So on the messaging front, my suggestion would be to play around with some of those themes that seem promising, to focus more on ingenuity, competitiveness, innovation, focus less on green, focus less right now on government's role, the federal government's role in this. I just don't think that's a winning message for you guys right now. I also think it's really important to talk about this as progress, promising, but not panacea. I think that's what got us into some trouble, being able to then deliver on those big grandiose claims. And lastly, there is, in the movement that works on this, there is a desire for some to have green jobs replace dirty jobs, right? And that's really important for a number of groups that are working on this issue. The challenge with pushing that hard right now is it pits the jobs against one another, and it opens you up to huge criticism around net job loss. It's just a really big point of vulnerability, and you can see the industry pushing hard on it, right? Anybody who moves transportation in the DC area has seen over the last year the Petroleum Institute and the natural gas campaigns with things in all the metro stations about, you want a job, you could have a job with us. We have hundreds of thousands of jobs if you just build that pipeline, right? So want to be really careful of that. I just think in the short term it makes you really vulnerable. There are long-term strategies for moving in that direction, but right now when all anybody wants is a job, it's hard to have an argument that says we can't have that kind of job, we should have this kind. We want as many jobs as possible right now. Related to message supports, I would love to see more diverse messengers being elevated, and that's something y'all could start doing right now. Having those messengers, particularly ones that are not so lefty, that are not so progressive, that are seen as more moderate or more conservative, that come from areas of the country that aren't traditionally seen as lefty. I think that creates a stronger drumbeat as you work on this within your communities and move it at a more regional level. Along with that, I think needing the right kinds of data and stories to support the kinds of messages you're using. So it's not so much that big panacea story of the new company and how many jillions of jobs are going to be created, but it's the more local story. And there are stories that look more like this. These are a few that we pulled out of the coverage this fall. So in the first one, it was in Voice of America. It was a story about one company and one family and the changes that were happening for them, how they were now thriving because of, in this case, it was because of sort of stimulus spending that focused in on green economy. There's one about veterans finding employment in the East Bay. There's one about a particular remodeling center that's offering 100 green jobs. Those kinds of stories are really powerful because they feel real and they feel believable to folks. And that kind of data point, even though 100 jobs or one company or one family, they're not gajillions, but they're very real. And they don't get you into that trap of those big grandiose claims that folks don't find believable. Related to countering the opposition, I think as a field, we need to trade that creativity for a bit more consistency. And that's something that also takes a longer term investment in a message platform, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But in the shorter term, y'all can do it within your own organizations, right? Within your own communities, you can think about what are the core messages we're going to use, what are the 1 or 2 or 3 things, and really drive a drumbeat on those, as opposed to kind of working the scattershot approach of let's throw it all out and see what sticks. Also related to opposition, they have people. I'm pretty sure they wear trench coats and they hang out in seedy alleys. And their jobs are to find the holes in our stories. And man, in Solyndra, did they find the holes, right? And I think what we need to start doing before we put up a story like that is really vet it. Is really understand, are there vulnerabilities here that are going to come back and bite us if the opposition finds them? And if there are and they're significant, we don't want to use that story. Right? I'd rather you not use that story than open yourself up to that kind of criticism down the line. So really, making like our opposition a bit and how we vet the stories we're using so that we don't end up in that tough spot. Those are all some things we could start doing right now. A little bit further down the pike, although we're certainly talking with Surdna and Rockefeller and other foundations right now about how to begin moving these things, I think we need to move away from this green jobs phrase. I think at this point it has too much baggage. Sometimes we at Spitfire try to weigh, can it be salvaged? Can we rehab it? Does it need to go? And my sense is it has too much baggage. Too political. The green isn't moving right now. Really associated with things like failures and boondoggles, which are not the kinds of positive associations you want to have. And so I think we need to figure out what that alternate is. What are we talking about here? And I think to do that, I don't have a ready, easy answer. There needs to be some more research. And I'd love that research to come in the form of building what I think of as a message platform the field could use. And that doesn't mean everybody's saying the exact same thing every day, although I'd like that. I recognize that's not totally realistic. I think what it does mean is that as a field, we have the discipline to sort of pick the space we're going to talk about, the frame we're going to play in, how we're going to have the conversation. We're going to really focus it on the economy. Are we going to really focus it on jobs? Are we really going to focus on the clean energy piece? We're picking that sort of overarching theme. And then within it, we have a few core messages that work with different audiences, that work for different organizations. So eventually, we have a grid that looks like that opposition grid, right? Where we can really map, here are our set of core messages that are under our platform. Here are the organizations or groups in the field. And here's how we show our message discipline on this grid. So that we're creating the strong drumbeat and we are the ones who are defining what this green economy looks like and what the benefits are. As opposed to ceding that to the other side to poke a lot of holes in it. Related to that, once you have the message in place, it would be great to have stronger message supports for y'all to draw on and for you guys to be able to create the same drumbeat around those that the opposition does around their favorite stories and data points. And I think that as we looked at the Surdna Foundation grantees specifically, we heard that finding these stories was sometimes a challenge. Having the capacity to pull these stories together, to make sure that you have good messengers to deliver them, to understand how you keep them fresh within a story bank. And I think that's a place where those of you who are working on the ground in communities could be partnered up with some of the organizations that are working more regionally or more nationally, and we could you guys probably have a lot more access to those stories than NRDC does, for example. So finding ways to create those kinds of partnerships and synergies so we all have a stronger base of message supports to draw upon would be terrific. And lastly, what we heard and saw from the Surdna response is that there's not a very coordinated system for responding to a crisis on our side of this conversation. And we were pretty slow out of the gate. And once we did come out, the messages weren't very coordinated. And as I mentioned before, they were mostly coming from sort of the usual suspects. We think there is space for a more coordinated system of tracking those kinds of issues and responding. And it could be something that happens within communities or in pockets or within certain collaboratives like this one. It could be something that happens more broadly across the whole field, and there are different ways to test that and pilot it. But we do think that not all opposition is worth responding to, but some needs a response, right? And having this kind of system can help you make that strategic decision and also help to understand not everyone responds to everything. So you can sort of sometimes say, well, this isn't the right one for my organization, but I know that those other groups are going to go out hard on this, so we can take a back seat this time. So really kind of thinking through that and what that would look like, how you might test it, something else we're thinking about with Surdna right now. So this slide just has a quick rundown of those different recommendations. I will leave it up, and I do want to ask, before I dive into your feedback on the recommendations, which I'm dying for, are there any clarifying questions on the recommendation before we go to more feedback and comments? So anything I just walked through that was not clear?
I think it's clear. It's a question about the discussion you had on the story bank.
Mm-hmm.
Were you talking about specific templates? Did you get to that point? Or any supports for generating the stories from the field? Because a lot of people in the field have a lot of stories, but they're not paid to package them, produce them, send them somewhere else, etc.
Absolutely. So that's exactly what we're talking with Surdna and with some of the grantees about right now, is what would it take to actually put that together. There are lots of different models, both within this field and in other issues to look at. For instance, in healthcare, Families USA is largely known as the organization that's cracked the nut on how to run a story bank around stories on healthcare. So I think there's some learning to be done, and there's also some sort of asset mapping to understand where those stories are, who's already doing stories. I mean, NRDC has someone on staff to collect stories. Like, that was a really good thing to find out. So really understanding that and then thinking about that. And I think it's been exciting to talk with Surdna about next steps, and I think Surdna is really committed to figuring out where to sort of focus support for the next phase of this work. I didn't talk out of turn there, Phil.
I'm going to say something though. You didn't speak out of turn.
Am I on? I'm on now. I think the other thing that was really interesting was how completely under-resourced for communications in general our grantees were. Even the big guys, even the ones that you would assume have a multi-pronged team and approach and a whole strategic plan around communications, largely it was missing. And that was really striking, a real striking difference from, not to say them again, the Heritage Foundation, which is deeply resourced on the communication side. So that for us was just an important kind of aha that even if we scheme to create a story bank, it's not just like snap your fingers, here's a story bank, guys contribute, because most organizations that we work with, that we fund, that most of your organizations don't have the capacity, as you were just saying, Joel, to actually do that.
Yeah. So we're looking with Surdna at how you marry the right kind of capacity building and communication skill building with the right kinds of resources, with the kinds of infrastructure pieces like a story bank, so that you have kind of all the legs of that stool to actually make it move forward. It's not just that if you build it, they will come strategy. All right, wow, lots of questions.
Bob Vierhoff from Cleveland. And it's not a question, it's a comment.
That's great.
Deborah was saying it earlier, we didn't care if it was green or blue, whatever color jobs you want to tag to it. Because, and you just said issues, what do we want to fight? What do we want to engage our time into? An example, in Ohio, fracking's going on. We could all go jump in, this is going to ruin our environment, take that message as Emerald Cities, but if we do that, we really open up ourselves to jobs that have been created by that. And I just witnessed building trades that came out of a steel mill that put a new line in for the piping to do that work in Ohio. So we take that battle on, we chose the wrong fight.
Right.
in my opinion. So we got to pick our battles. That's my first message. So the second piece is maybe the whole message of green jobs was wrong in the first place. Maybe it should have been putting America back to work or putting folks back to work, because we had benches that were full in the building trades, and they were going to go out and work first. So this whole notion that when we build this new economy, that we were going to turn around and add more folks first, add more folks, and the reality is we're going to put a whole bench full of folks out there first, and they're going to go out to work first. So maybe as we go forward, we look at still with the job numbers that are out there, putting America back to work. Just a thought.
I think there is an interesting message theme that's worth testing around the jobs America needs right now. And I think that that gives you a little bit of a broader frame than that, but that's part of that, right? The jobs America needs right now are the jobs that take advantages of the skills that people already have and get them back to work. They're the ones that learn from programs that have been proven to work in localities and create more of those programs so that we have the jobs we need. They're the ones that are in growing industries, not dying industries. I mean, so there's a lot of room within that framing. It's not tested. It's a Spitfire original. So, but I think it's one that I'm really eager to see how that does play, or some variation of it. It does change the frame way out of green, but it still has that idea of sustainability throughout it if you think about what those different points are that fall underneath. So I think it's an interesting one to think about in line with what you were saying. There were a number of other hands over here.
Just here.
Media network, print, mass media with its broadcasting and air, then we can have great messages, but then we don't know who to give them to. We can have the data, or we can have a rapid response system, but who do we call? Ghostbusters. We've got to find a way to, and it could be local media networks, and building them, because these guys, they're journalists, they're reporters, they need stories, they need data, and they, more importantly, need relationships. So I think we really may have to make certain that Surdna helps us figure out how we build those media networks and have then a central repository so we can plug in our messages that can go viral across our
I would only say Surdna and others.
And others.
So Danielle, maybe 2 more questions. I know we're getting close to an hour.
I think that's right.
Hi, Lois DeBacker from the Kresge Foundation. I always find research like this really, really helpful, and at the same time, some of it feels like deja vu. In that it's been so many years that we've known that the right is really good at message discipline and the left is really bad at it. And so I guess, how can we make it be different this time? And then Danielle, I want to ask the question, several times you've used the word, the field needs to, we need to. Who is the field? And who are the we?
Right. So, it was interesting as we were just at a meeting of Surdna grantees, and somebody said, we can never give them the same message. And I said, it's not possible. And I said, really? The right does it? And they're like, oh, you're right. So it is an old story. Here's how I've seen it done in other fields, and I'll talk about what I mean by field in a minute. Spitfire has worked with a coalition of Packard Foundation grantees in the States who are working on children's health care. And we created a set of narrative messages, a message platform, and we provided direct assistance to those grantees to help them use those messages. And once others in the field saw that those messages were getting traction and having success, they were eager to adopt them in their own communication. So we created sort of a test pilot group, and then were able to ripple out from there. That work helped to secure the reauthorization of the Children's Health Insurance Bill, which was a really exciting victory for the folks that we worked with on that. So we know that it's possible to do, and part of it is finding the right sort of influencers within a field who are eager to work on it. Not everybody is eager to change their messaging. And providing the right combination of well-tested messaging and good kind of communications resources and support so that they can put it into use. So I've seen it happen there. We've done similar work in the sustainable seafood movement and around public defense and criminal justice. So I know it's possible. It really does take a field, and now I'll talk about that a little bit, who is going to work together on it. So when I say the field, I think broadly the field that we've been working with is the field of Surdna's grantees that work on this issue, and those grantees are shared with other foundations certainly as well. And they range from local to regional to national. They range from organizations that come at this from more of a social equity perspective, those that come at this from more of an environmental, carbon climate perspective, those that are doing more economic development work in regions, those from the labor side. I mean, it really is pretty broad. I think you're going to need that because this is the kind of cross-cutting issue that doesn't just involve sort of one sort of organization. And I think it's more than just nonprofit organizations, it's also government, private sector. Certainly Ceres is a part of that group, and it's been really interesting to get their insights on their work with businesses. So when I use that shorthand as the field, that's really what I'm thinking through. All right, I think we have time for one more, and then we need to close. A final word, perhaps? Oh, all right. Phil, do you want to?
No, just join me in thanking Denise.
Yeah.